Hey everybody, this is Chris Newhan with McSteed TV, and I'm going to go over how I set up an IK leg and foot rig. This is the same setup I have on the factions characters. They're very simple characters, so I can just skin straight to this setup. If you have a more complex setup, like a more realistic human, you would have to do some extra stuff, but you can use this leg setup to drive your rig. Let's get started. Okay, so I have this bone chain here. All the bones are named. I this is the one of the few places in my life where I'm this organized. I keep everything named. That way, when I'm further into rigging, I know what I'm looking at. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create an IK chain from this bone thigh down to the foot bone, and that will control the leg itself. So I'm going to go to Animation, IK Solvers, History Independent Solver, and there I have that first joint, or the first IK setup for the leg. I'm going to go ahead and name this. This is my naming convention that I've used forever. I list anything that's hidden on a particular layer as help for helper objects. Okay, so now the next IK chain will be from the foot bone to the toe bone. It's just one chain long, or one bone long. And then the last one is going to be from the foot to the tip. And then let me name these really quick. It's really good habit to get into naming things as you go along, because it's a pain and tedious to rename everything after the fact. Okay, so that's the basics of the IK setup, and now we will set up the helper objects that drive the motion of this. Okay, so now let's set up the helpers. At first, I noticed that I had named this IK chain foot and this one foot, so I renamed this one to leg. So I'm going to create a couple of helper objects. I use the point helpers because you can change their display, so you can use them sort of as icons. You become used to what certain things represent in your own rigs, so it's easy to find your way around. So the first one I'm going to create, I'm going to align it to the ball of the foot, and I'm going to name this help foot help ball. I'm going to change the size of this to be about 4. The size really doesn't affect the rig at all. It's just a way to control the clutter when you're trying to work. Okay, so the next one that I'm going to create would actually be at the heel of the character. I don't have a mesh in here at the moment, but imagine that the mesh of the foot comes down along like this. I'm going to place this right at the point where the heel would connect to the ground. So let me rename this. And then the next one I'm going to place is going to be at the toe. Okay, so each one of these things will control a certain part of the foot. And for instance, this IK chain will be linked to the helper at the ball of the foot. And what that will do is when we set up a control to rotate this, the foot will start to bend up as we use the control for this. And then we're going to need one more helper in here that's in the exact same spot. And this one is going to be used to control the toe rotation. So I'm going to name it Help Toe Rot. I'm going to make it a little bit smaller so it can be seen inside of there. Also, I'm going to change the color so it'll be easier to tell that it does something different in the scene. So now I'm going to set up the hierarchy of how the different IK chains and the helpers are connected to each other so the foot can roll properly when the setup is final. Okay, so as I said before, this gets parented to that. This IK chain gets parented to the toe. And this IK at the end of the foot gets parented to this toe rot, the small helper in here. Notice that this guy is not named correctly. So that sets up the IK chains, but now I need to parent the helpers correctly. So both of these helpers get parented to this front, the toe, and then the toe itself gets parented to the heel. So what that gives me is if I want the entire foot to rotate up, I use this front rotation, or the front helper. If I want just the ball to come up, I use the ball. If I want just it to roll on the heel, like if you're doing a walk and you want the heel to hit plant first, you use the heel helper. And then finally, if I want the toe itself to move, I would use that. Notice that I have not done any rotation or reorienting of these helper objects. I like to keep them aligned to the world, meaning I have X in line with the world X, Z is pointing up, Y is pointing back. The reason I do this is I like to keep everything with as few transforms on it as possible. I've seen some other tutorials where people are resetting up Y to be up, which I don't know if it's a Maya thing or what, but I like to keep everything set up the way Max wants it to be, so there's less confusion. I don't have to change rotation orders or anything weird like that. All right, now that I have that set up, you can see that if I move this, the whole foot moves. And now I just need to set up the controls that will drive this, because we don't have to select the helper objects. Those will be hidden on a layer all the time, so we don't have to look at them. I generally create my controls with splines. It's helpful to have them in a different category so you can hide by category. So what I'm doing is I'm creating a rectangle, making it 5 by 5, and then I'm going to duplicate it, move it up 5 in Z, so this is the basis of a cube drawn with splines. Now I'm going to rotate this 90 degrees. For some reason that's behaving weird. So this original spline that I made, I'm going to use that. I'm going to convert it to an editable spline and attach the other parts. Now any further scaling I do with this object, I want to do it all in sub-object mode. The reason for that is I don't want to have to reset the transform all the time by, if I scale it, you don't want to have that scale introduced into your rig because it can cause problems. So I'm going to change the vertice types to corner, and then that way I can move them around without having weirdness. So first let me align this to the ball of the foot. I like to have rotations from the ball because when you're standing on the ground, your foot tends to pivot from the ball of the foot. I mean, you can pivot from the heel, but most of the time, especially if you're just standing around and talking, gesturing, little movements tend to pivot from the ball of the foot. So I'm going to shape this to be around the size of where the foot mesh would be. And this is going to become my main foot control. So I'm going to call it control, or CTRL underscore foot. And now I'm going to create a control for the foot roll. And this is one of the big things that I do that I think is different than a lot of people. I don't like having lots of things that I have to go over to the modify panel to control. I like to have things that I can just click on in viewport and move around. So I set up the foot roll and I tie it to the rotation of this control. Now I want this thing to be 90 degrees to the foot, so it can represent like a dial sort of. But again, I don't want to introduce that extra rotation into the rig, so I'm going to rotate it in sub-object mode. To 90 degrees. And then I'm going to align it to this just to get its position correct. And it's going to sit out in front of the foot like this. Now one other thing I do with this usually is I'm shift dragging this to create a copy of it inside of sub-object. And the point of this piece is to just give me a visual indication of which way that control is pointing. So now it has this arrow, so as I rotate it, it will be pointing. It's pretty arbitrary, but it helps me visually. Okay, for the last control I created a spline object that is just 3 circles. It sort of creates a sphere-like icon. And this is going to be for the ankle. Now in my foot setup, since I like the foot to pivot from the ball, I don't necessarily want it to pivot from there when the foot is in the air. I like to treat the foot as FK, or the way you would animate the hand of a character. So I'm aligning that to the IK chain that represents the leg. And so now when I set this up finally, I'll be able to rotate the foot from that spot. Okay, so let me connect all these controls so you can see how they all work. So the foot is the master control. So I'm going to go ahead and link both of these objects to the foot. Let me rename this before I get too far. CTRL underscore ankle. And then this one, CTRL foot roll. Okay, so we already have the hierarchy of this part set up correctly, but now we need to connect it to the foot controls. So this helper object, which is currently the top node, is going to be linked to that ankle, and that's pretty much it for that part. So now if I move this around the the whole foot goes with it. If I want to rotate the foot, you can see we have a problem. The bones aren't actually following it. And the reason that is we need to correct these. So I'm going to go to the motion panel. I selected the IK for the leg, and I'm going to change the parent space right here to IK goal, and do that for the other two as well. And what that'll do is it'll make the bones follow the rotation of the objects that are driving it. So now you can see that doesn't flip anymore. And you can see that as I rotate this, the ankle or the knee follows the foot. So now I have all the pieces in place, everything is named, and now I'm going to set up the foot roll. And again, I like to have a very simple setup. I mean, a lot of people do things to allow you to rock the foot back and forth and all sorts of little tweaks and stuff like that you can do. And I just haven't found myself using that. So I keep the setup simple. I've been animating with this basic setup. It's changed a little bit over the years, but I've been animating with it for a while, and I can get almost any thing that I need out of it. Especially in factions, it's very forgiving because I'm animating in step keys. So I never see like weird shifts and things like that I have to counter because I have to place everything. What we're going to do to control this is the rotation of this object is going to control the rotation of each one of these helper objects. And we're going to use the reaction manager, which if you're from Maya is similar to the set driven keys. Reaction manager is under the animation menu. And what we need to do before we set up any of these reactions is I'm going to select all three of these controls. I'm going to freeze their transforms. And what this does is it gives you the ability to not only zero out the rotations or position. See, if I rotate this, I can always go to Alt right click, rotation to 0, and it'll always snap back. But in addition to that, it gives me a 0 starting position for the driving of these other objects. Because if there's already rotation on there, it's going to add rotation to the objects that are being driven. First thing we need to do is add the master. That just means that this is the object that's going to control the other ones. So I selected this foot rotation. I'm going to go to transform, rotation, and then choose this 0 Euler XYZ and choose X rotation. And since I know that I kept this object with X being in the same direction as these helper objects, I know that I can just directly add this to the X rotation and not have to worry about keeping track of which direction things are pointing. I selected all three of these, but let me show you what happens if you do these one at a time. So I can go add slave, I click it, transform, rotation, X rotation, go to add the next one, transform, rotation, X rotation. You see how it created states each time, and those are things you're just going to have to clean up, so it's better to just add them all at once, and then it creates one state for the position, the initial rotation of each one of these. So add selected, transform, rotation, X rotation, and you can see it added all of them at once, and you didn't have to go do it each individual time. It's also a time saver. We have our initial state, all of these are at 0, and we're going to set up so as I rotate this object, it's going to rotate this and then this, and if I rotate it backwards, it's going to rotate this. I've done this I don't know how many times, hundreds. So as a starting point, I will just do this as 45 and set the ball to 45, and most of the time it works okay. So that works. And if you had a mesh here, you would have to do a little bit different. You might have to do some tweaking on these numbers. So I have that one now. I'm going to create another state. Let's actually name these so we know what they are. So this one, I'm going to type in the number 90, and then I'm going to have the toe rotate 90. So now as I rotate this up to 45, it's going to rotate the ball, but then after that point, it's going to rotate the whole foot. The last one to do is the heel. So I'm going to create another state, call it heel, and this one I'm going to do to negative 45 degrees and type in negative 45 degrees for the heel. So now as I rotate back, it goes that way. As I rotate up, it goes this way. And that covers it for the reaction manager. Usually, like I said earlier, I like to have something in screen that I can grab and move rather than having custom attributes added in the modify panel. But I have two exceptions to that because they're controls that I just don't use all that much. So I'm going to add an attribute holder to this, to the toe control for the foot roll. And what this is going to do is it's going to drive this toe rotation. And the way I'm going to do that is with the parameter editor. Usually I've created scripts for most of this, but I'm not a scripter, and for me to try and give you a tutorial on scripting would be dumb. So I'm going to name this toe rot for toe rotation. I'm going to make the width 80, and I'm going to make the range of this way more than I'll ever need because it's a pain when you run into limitations in the rig. So selected objects current modifiers, the add to type, everything else is set. It's float by default. So I can hit add, and now that control is there. So I'm going to add another custom attribute, and that's to the foot control. So I'm going to add the attribute holder, and this one is going to control the knee rotation. Everything else, other than changing the name to knee, everything else is the same, 80, 180 to 180, and add that one. Now the reason I do this, I'm sure anyone who's played around with rigs has seen rigs with a pull vector or something similar, an aim constraint for the knee. The way Max's IK works, the way the knee tends to follow the foot anyway, I find that I'm not doing that much counter animation, but if I have that control out here, I end up doing a lot of counter animation. So I just set it up as this custom attribute because I find I'm rarely having to tweak that. So now we are going to wire these. We're going to use wire parameters to control these. The wire parameters, you access that just through the right click menu, and it's down here. So what I'm going to wire is this tow rod to this helper object here. So the tow rod I get through modified object, attribute holder, custom attributes, tow rod, and then drag the little rubber band to transform, rotation, X rotation. As you can see, it populated this list from left to right. I try to remember to always select the controlling object first and then the controlled object. That way it's always left to right and you don't have to wonder. So then I can always use the one-way connections, the bottom button, and connect. So I have one more thing to do to this, because right now you see as I rotate this, it's rotating way more than it should. And that has to do with Max's internal rotation calculations. So what we need to do is convert degrees to radians. So there's a simple command, deg to rad. Just add that to the expression down here. You can put this in parentheses if you want, if you prefer that visually. It doesn't need it. So I hit update, and now you can see that this is going, as I rotate it, it's driving the toe rotation. I don't like the fact that up is down, so I'm going to do times -1 update. So now up is up and down is down. Okay, so the next one, I can close this. The next one I'm going to, for the knee, again go to wire parameters, modified object, attribute holder, custom attributes, knee. And this one I'm going to go to this IK helper right here. And what I want to control is the swivel angle. And again, since I did it in this order, I just need to select that bottom one. And this is another setting that needs that deg to rad. Connect. And I can close that. So if I move the knee up, it'll be more obvious. So now I can control the swivel angle of the knee. And that's really it on this subject. I can hide the helpers now and I get a little bit cleaner view. So as I rotate, you can see the foot going up and coming up, going back on the heel, coming up on the toe. And if I want the foot to be able to twist while it's in the air, or if I want to have it pivot on the heel. And also I froze the transforms on all these, so if I ever want to go back to 0, rotation to 0. Depending upon the character you have, if you have this set up and the character is pretty symmetrical, you can actually duplicate this entire setup, well, with the helpers and everything. You can clone this whole setup and it should all work. Most of the time it works. Just make sure you save before you do it, because I have had it crash sometimes when doing that. So one last thing I'm going to show you is for the factions characters, I didn't need to do any complex twisting across the bones or anything like that. But one thing I do in order to maintain volume in the knee is I set up a bone that divides the rotation of this joint in half, so it keeps the knee cap where it's supposed to be. So I'm going to create a helper object, and I'm going to line it to this in position and rotation, and then I'm going to parent it to the thigh bone. So what that gives us, you'll see, is it rotates, or it doesn't rotate when the knee rotates. And so now what I'm going to do is I usually use a bone tip, and since I have one here, I'm just going to clone it really quick. And I'm going to call it bone knee. Let me call this help knee. So I'm going to align this to that. So now I have this bone aligned in here, and it's kind of hard to see, so I'm going to change its size a little bit. And the size is just for display purposes. It's irrelevant to the rigging. Even though Max has the ability to use the size of the bone to set up the envelopes, you end up having to re-weight all that stuff anyway, so it's kind of pointless. I am going to link this bone to the thigh bone, and it actually doesn't really matter whether you link it to the shin bone or the thigh bone. So next, what I want to do, I want this to divide the rotation between this object and this object. The way we're going to do that was with an orient constraint. So the orientation constraint, I have a shortcut key here, or short toolbar button, but you can get it under animation constraint, orientation constraint, to the helper, and then do it again to the shin bone. So now, if I turn this to the side, it'll be more obvious. As I lift the foot up, you can see that that is not turning as much as the other joint. And when you skin the knee, which I'll do in a later tutorial, you're going to skin the center line of verts of the knee to this bone, and that'll help it maintain volume. And that's pretty much it.